And I will pass immediately to our next speaker, again, a dear friend, Breandan Ward. He is an adjunct, forget it. He's a professor at NYU, a great friend, and he will share with us Enableism in academia, 4 ways universities can stimulate greater disability inclusion in the world of work. Breandan, you're with us?
Thank you, Michal.
Thank you, and I hope you're with us from the beginning, so good for you, great.
Well, as I'm visually impaired, I'll get your help. I think I have a blue shirt on, Michal.
Yes, you do. You have a blue shirt, and the background is amazing.
Definitely virtual.
You're totally organized in your background.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michal. And as we come into this home straight on the webinar today, I wanted to pause and reflect on upstream in the process, upstream of employment, the whole world of education. So we've heard from Daniela earlier on how many people around the world with disabilities are unemployed. She said 70% on average. And I'll just put some specifics around that. Take 3 relatively small countries, Israel, my home country of Ireland, and the United Arab Emirates, 3 small countries, 2.3 million people alone with disabilities in our 3 countries that are unemployed. And it's people like me who are visually impaired. It's people like you who might have some other kind of disability, whether visible or invisible. And that's people for whom the dignity of work, the chance to contribute to the economy, the innovation that comes from our contribution, the sense of purpose, it's all withheld. And we've heard earlier from many speakers the cost to our economy and to our society. For a moment, though, I want to speak to you out there. If you happen not to have a disability, perhaps you have not a disability yet, because we know that sooner or later, limitations in function, limitations in participation, they come to all of us sooner or later. And what I'd like to ask you is to reflect on your job. Statistically speaking, the chances are you have a job and that you got an education that helped prepare you for that job. Think about how you learned how to read, to write, to do math. You learned how to socialize with people outside your family. These are all things you learned in education, norms that you've carried forward into the world of work. And you know, there's 4 questions around education that I'd like you to consider. The first one's this: access. Were you able to access the classrooms, the exams, the materials, the grades that you needed, not just to start a degree at university, but to complete it? Second question around representation. When you were at university, were you surrounded by teachers, professors, academic staff, even other students who looked, acted, or sounded like you did? Third, the curriculum that you studied, did you somehow see your own life experience represented in the curriculum that you studied? And last, partnerships with employers. Were you somehow benefiting from links between your university and employers to help you get your job? Well, in my case, I have to say, looking back on my undergraduate degree, the answer for all 4 questions for me is yes. But I think that's because my own diagnosis with a degenerative eye disease and the sight loss that followed, that all happened after I finished my undergrad. Had it happened before, I think the answer would be no. And after I finished undergrad and started work, I worked for 15 years in investment banking during a time as my sight got worse. And did I encounter ableist prejudice, ableist barriers? Did I feel less than my so-called able-bodied colleagues? Well, at times, yes. And I always thought that these ableist barriers and prejudices, I thought when they show up in the world of work or even in the education system, I thought they were just a product of broader society. And that all changed for me when I left my job in the bank to go back to school, to NYU to study a master's. And then after that, started teaching at NYU on the topic of disability. And suddenly it hit me. Once back in the education system, I suddenly realized that those norms that we learn at school, the things we learn in university, we carry them forward into our world of work. What other norm do we learn in the education system? The norm of disability exclusion. There's a quote from Robert Louis Stevenson that says, sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. And I feel that exclusion of disability in the world of work is one of those consequences of our education system. And it doesn't need to be this way. There's an opportunity in our education system to teach not a norm of ableism, but actually enableism. And there's 4 ways I believe that universities in particular can make a difference to help us achieve the sustainable development goals that Daniela shared earlier. 4 ways that universities can make a difference. The first is access. We know in the United States, on average every year, 200,000 people graduate with masters in business administration. And these are people who often go on to middle and senior management roles in organizations. And the same is true in many other countries. How many of them do you think have a disability? There's a survey back in 2020 by the Canadian organization Enable to Success that surveyed 184 MBA applicants and graduates from around the world. And they found that at least half had no means of disclosing their disability as part of the application process. And even those who did apply and get in and complete their MBA, only about half said that it was worthwhile to disclose their disability. So access is a real issue. Inaccessible education prevents students with disabilities from gaining the degrees and the grades comparable to their so-called able-bodied peers. And this disadvantages their work prospects, their job prospects. So if you work in a university or you have influence on a university like an employer or in government, in policy, then make sure that education is accessible to people with disabilities. That's the first way. The second way is representation. The CDC in the US estimates somewhere between 24 and 29% of the US adult population has some kind of disability or health condition. So think about university and the faculty that taught you and the academic staff that supported you. Was disability represented? There's 3 ways this could be done, 3 quite simple ways. One is, like any other employer and organization, put disability into your diversity and inclusion plan and don't have it as a peripheral plan, integrate it as a core pillar of your operating model, just like any other organization. As we heard from Susan earlier, the question to ask here is, what about disability? There's ways to attract disabled talent, get rid of the exclusionary language in job descriptions, put people with disability on the search committees, make sure you represent disability on your websites, and make sure you post your job vacancies in places where people with disabilities like me can find them. These are all ways that we can improve representation within academia. Third is the question of curriculum. And this is a topic I work with several universities on. It's about this paradox. We heard from Lewis earlier that so many countries have ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that says that the burden falls to mainstream society to make goods and services and structures meet the diverse needs of the human condition. So why on earth is accessibility not on the mainstream curriculum in our universities? Getting this accessibility topic into our mainstream degrees is a vital part of showing the social model in action in our education system. So if you work in a university or you have influence on a university, ask them, where is accessibility on your curriculum? And finally, employer partnerships. There's some great work already being done to partner universities with employers for dedicated pipeline of graduates for other marginalized groups. Again, what about disability? There's great work in the UK by a small organization with great impact called Employability. They've managed to help 15,000 graduates into employment through targeted internships and graduate schemes. And their philosophy is to work with next generation universities and employers like JP Morgan and Google. And they're interested in best practice beyond compliance. They're interested in inclusion not as an exception, but an expectation. So if you're working in university or have influence like an employer, then ask this question: where are the partnerships, the pipelines dedicated to people with disabilities from their degrees into employment? And that element of training and professional qualification, as Yuval mentioned earlier, is a really important next stage in this journey of progress. So finally, access, representation, curriculum, and employer partnerships. These are four very tangible ways that universities can make a difference. These are ways that upstream in education, we can change the system. It's time to stop teaching ableism in academia. It's time that universities teach enableism and make disability inclusion the norm in the world of work. I'd love to hear from you and talk more offline. Meantime, I'm heading back to Michal, the timekeeper. Thanks, Michal.
The bad timekeeper. But the problem is I'm fascinating from everything that is being said here, and I forget the watch, my fault, but you are right on time. So thank you very much. And definitely something to think about.